So again, thank you for joining us. And I have the pleasure of introducing our guest all the way from the other side of the country, Sheree Smith. And she is the award-winning author of 8 young adult and middle grade novels, children's nonfiction, and comic books. And I was lucky enough to meet her at a conference last year. And actually, I have one of her signed books right here that we may talk about in a little bit. But I am going to turn it over to her so she can talk about being a writer, her books, and a little bit about World War II. And then at the end, I'm going to come back on and we're going to answer all of your questions. So again, remember, if you have questions, type them in the Q&A. And with that, Sheree, I'm going to turn it over to you. Take it away.
Thank you, Kate. That's amazing. I can't believe you still have the book. That makes me happy. Hi, everybody. I'm Sheree. And as Kate said, I write young adult and middle grade fiction and nonfiction and comic books. But I'm here today because one of the things that I have fallen into is writing about World War II, specifically World War II aviators. And so I've put together a talk called Red Tail, Wasp, and Firefly, the Aviators of World War II, that I'd like to share with you today. So I'm going to share my screen so you can look at something other than my happy face. Here we go. All right, so something to know, and most of you probably know this, but this year is the 75th anniversary of World War II. And unfortunately, due to the state of the world, I don't think we've been paying as much attention and honoring the anniversary to the level that we certainly would have if the world was open currently. And so I think it's important to take a moment in this year to sit back and think about what happened 75 years ago to bring us to where we are today in a lot of ways. And in thinking about this talk today, I just sort of realized that this is a talk about patriots. This is a talk about people who loved their countries. So let's see, there we go. My 3 books that I'm going to talk about today are Fly Girl, Who Were the Tuskegee Airmen, and The Blossom and the Firefly. And so how this happened was, Fly Girl was my first, it was my 4th book, but my first World War II book. So I'm gonna start talking about that. And then you'll see how each book sort of gave birth to the last. So, Fly Girl. I live in Los Angeles. I am, at the time I was working for a comic book company, and I had, because it's LA, I had about a 10-mile or 45-minute drive home, and I'm listening to the radio. And on NPR, there's a radio documentary program called Radio Diaries, and they did a piece about the Women Airforce Service Pilots. And these were a group of civilian women who were trained to fly military planes during World War II. They flew them here in the States to free up men to fly overseas. That was how it was billed, free a man to fly. And so women who knew how to fly would try out for this program. And the radio documentary, and I urge you to watch it, listen to it if you can. I will point out I have a little bibliography at the end of this that I can tell you how to get, and that'll give you links to things. But in that radio program, they interviewed one of the women who'd been an Air Force service pilot, and she said, "We were farm girls and heiresses thrown together." And that really stuck in my head. And so on the cover of this book, you'll see this young woman, Ida Mae Jones, who is a farm girl who's learned to fly on her father's crop duster. And when I started thinking about it, and I listened to that radio piece, the next day I went to work, and one of my friends said, "Did you hear that piece about the WASP?" That's what they're called, WASP, W-A-S-P, for Women's Air Force Service Pilots. She said, "I think that's your next book." I said, "You know, I think you're right, but what makes it my book?" And so one of the challenges that the WASP had was, it was a man's army. And so there was a lot of gender bias. And I thought, well, who else was struggling with bias in the 1940s? African-American people. And so Ida Mae Jones is a light-skinned Black girl who passes for white in order to join the Women's Air Force Service Pilots program, because the Army in 1941 was segregated. It was a Jim Crow Army, and that meant that African Americans could serve, but not with whites. They could be commanded by white officers, but Black soldiers had Black doctors, white soldiers had white doctors, and women entering the fray was controversial. So the program, which was started by this woman, Nancy Love had already started a ferrying program at the beginning of the war. And ferrying means that she worked with a group of women who would take new planes from the factory and fly them to the coast to be shipped off overseas for the fighting. And she teamed up with this other woman, Jackie Cochran. Jackie Cochran was a really interesting lady who had a cosmetics company. And she also was a daredevil of a pilot. She was the first woman to break the sound barrier in the 1950s. She used to fly in races. And so she had a lot of flash. And the two of them together convinced the military to start this program to let women do missions such as ferrying planes from factories to the coast to be shipped off. They would also test out plane repairs. If an airplane had been damaged and repaired, the women would fly that to make sure it was fixed, which is dangerous work. Even more dangerous was target towing, where they would actually fly and pull targets so that soldiers who were learning how to shoot planes out of the sky would shoot at the target to learn how to hit a plane. And sometimes they would also hit the plane because they were learning. It's kind of like getting your hair cut by your toddler. It's a little terrifying. So the program picked up. They trained here at Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas. So I've just said to you, Texas, 1940s, Jim Crow era. There was no way they could allow women of color into the Women's Air Force Service program. It was already difficult finding accommodations for the women because all of the military bases were designed for men. And so that was already a challenge. And then if they had to further segregate those women by race, it would have been too difficult. And so there were African-American women, Janet Bragg Harmon is one of them, who were skilled pilots who tried to get into the program and were not accepted. But here are some of the Women Air Force Service pilots, and you can see they wear, this is a black and white photo, but they wore a color called Santiago blue. And there are a lot of actually great songs based on the outfits that they had to wear, because the other thing they wore were flight outfits, which you'll see in a minute, that they called zoot suits after those baggy gangster suits of the 30s, because they were giant overalls designed for men. But who you're seeing here now is Fifinella. She's the mascot of the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, and she is a gremlin. She was designed, you can see there who signed this picture, she was designed by Walt Disney, who was so taken with the idea of female pilots that he wanted to give them a helper. So in World War II, pilots would say that gremlins were little monsters that would destroy your airplane. So anytime you had mechanical failure, they'd say it was the fault of a gremlin. There must be a gremlin in your plane. Fifinella was a helpful gremlin. She was there to make sure that the planes flew safely and that the women could fly. What's interesting is the women did fly very safely, in part because they were held to a much higher standard than the men. In order to fly in the military during World War II, a man had to have 200 hours of flight time and did not need to have a high school diploma. Women had to have a high school diploma and 500 hours of flight time before they could qualify. As a result, they were better pilots, they were more conscientious, and they were daring. There's a story that I include in Fly Girl, the B-17 bomber was called the Widowmaker. Men were afraid to fly it. It was difficult to fly. And so the military actually had some women from the WASP program fly it to show men that it could be done. And after that, they were willing to fly the plane. And that is actually the plane that brought the bombs to Japan that ended the war. So let's see. This here is the wishing well on Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas. And when you flew your first solo flight to celebrate, they would dump you in the well. And here you see a group of women in these baggy outfits called zoot suits, and they are wearing parachutes. Parachutes were made out of silk in the 40s. And so if you ever had to bail out of a plane and use your parachute, you were officially a member of the Caterpillar Club, because silk comes from a cocoon. So I told you that there were no African-American women in the Women's Air Force Service Pilots. And that is true as far as I know. I started researching this book in 2005. There wasn't a lot of information readily available in 2005 about the WASP program. There was an overview, but some of those details were hard to find. So doing my research, I learned that there were 2 Asian women and 1 Latina who were accepted into the program. This is a photo of Hazel Ah Ying, who there are now some books about, but she was Asian woman accepted into the program. I could find the names for 2 of the women, but not for the Latina. Years after the book came out, I got an email from a woman, and she said, the Latina you were talking about is my mother. Her name is Vernita Rodriguez King. And she sent me a photo of her. And from that moment on, I started digging more, even though the book was already out and had been out for years, because I wanted to know. And since then, I've learned that there was at least 1 other Latina, and there was a Native American woman whose last name was Rexroth. So her nickname when she was flying was Sexy Rexy. So one of the tragedies, I think, of the Women's Air Force Service Pilots is these were civilian women. And so everything they did, they had to pay for. It wasn't like being a soldier where you get a salary from the government and you get veterans benefits. And so a few women, there were 1,102 Women's Air Force Service Pilots. Of that number, 38 women died in service. And if you died in service, it was your responsibility, your family's responsibility to retrieve your body, and you had no soldier's burial. It wasn't until 1979 that the WASP were finally acknowledged as veterans of World War II. And after the war, a lot of these women just went back home. They became wives. They couldn't even fly in commercial aviation because women were only allowed to be stewardesses back then. So a lot of people didn't know about the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, including, I started this book in grad school. This was my creative thesis, and my advisor was a veteran of World War II. And when I told him what I was writing about, he said, I've never heard of these women. And so now people have heard of them. And in 2009, they were finally awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. And they have finally been given the right, just recently, the past few years, to be buried at Arlington Cemetery. Of course, there are not that many WASP left today, so it is a late honor, but I'm glad they're getting it. So these are some of my resources in writing this book. When I write a book, I do a lot of book research. Here's the little image for Radio Diaries, because that's what inspired me. I do book research. If I can, I travel. And if I can, I meet people, which sort of leads us to my next book, Who Were the Tuskegee Airmen? So you guys might be familiar with these bobbleheaded covers. The Who HQ books are, it's a long running series about important historical events and people. I was at a party, part of an event, a writing event, and I met a woman who said she was an editor. And I said, oh, I write, what do you edit? And she said, I do the Who HQ books. And I said, oh, have you ever done a book about the Women's Air Force Service Pilots or the Tuskegee Airmen? And they had not. And so I did it for them, which was super exciting. But the reason I could write this book was because of this handsome devil. This is Lieutenant Colonel Robert Friend. That's him when he served in the Tuskegee Airmen on the left there as a young dreamy guy. And this on the other side is him in his 90s. Bob just passed away last year at the age of 99. You see him holding a model airplane. That is a replica of his P-51 Mustang that he flew during the war. And you'll see the nose art on that, the painting of a woman in a little yellow bikini, and it says Bunny. That is his wife. And the tail, you'll notice, is painted red on this plane. The Tuskegee Airmen were nicknamed the Red Tails or the Red Tail Angels because they needed something to identify them in the air, and red paint was the paint that was available. So I met Bob at an event because I had written Fly Girl, and we were doing an African Americans in Aviation conversation at a museum out here. I got to have an evening in conversation with him, and he's a Spitfire and a real delight. I hope that you can meet some of the people who served in World War II. I cannot believe how long-lived some of them are, and what wonderful, wonderful human beings they are. Just in terms of a love for life and a willingness to put themselves on the line for their nation. And so let's talk about that for a minute. World War II was the first war where the American military allowed pilots of color. And how that started is with this picture in a way. So in 1921, the United States military commissioned a study on African Americans and their suitability as soldiers. And they concluded that Black men were cowardly and not intelligent enough to fight, and certainly not to fly. That was clearly by design, because it was a segregated army and they wanted a reason to stay segregated. But as the war was approaching, these programs started up, civilian pilot training programs to train Americans to fly in case they were needed during the war, and so they could also patrol the coast in case there was ever any danger to our country. And the African American community, which had long been interested in aviation, going back to Bessie Coleman, who flew in the 1920s, the first African American woman to get her license, but she had to go to France to get it. And Eugene Bullard, an African American ace who flew in World War I, but he had to fly for France because the United States didn't want him. So there was this movement in the African American community to fly, and they finally were able to convince the government to allow civilian pilot training for African Americans, and that included down in Tuskegee, Alabama, which is where the Tuskegee Airmen ultimately were trained. And so this photo you see is a picture of Chief Anderson as the pilot, and that smiling woman in the back you might recognize as First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. She wrote a column, a weekly column, and one of her columns was about this trip she took down to Tuskegee because she wanted to see what these young fellows were up to. And she took a flight. And when America saw the president's wife willing to be flown by a Black man, it started to change minds, and the program got a little support, but it was still an uphill battle. This is General Benjamin O. Davis. Now, Davis is an interesting guy. He was chosen to lead the Tuskegee Airmen. So he was in the first class of Tuskegee pilots to be trained. What makes him interesting is that he is only the second African-American general in the United States Army, the first being his father. He was also only the third African-American student at West Point, which is a renowned military academy in New York State. And his fellows were not happy with him being there, his classmates, and so they tried to silence him, meaning they would not speak to him unless it was mandatory for classwork. So for the years that he was there, nobody ate a meal with him and nobody spoke to him, and he still graduated with flying colors. Now, Davis wasn't a pilot, but when the opportunity for the Tuskegee Airmen program, which was called the Tuskegee Experiment, because they didn't know that it would work. They didn't think it would work, actually. He signed on and he learned to fly. He wasn't the best pilot out there, but he was the best leader they could have asked for. Something that would happen in World War II, pilots, some pilots are real hot dogs and they like to have a good time, right? There wouldn't be a movie called Top Gun if that wasn't true. And so pilots had this reputation. They wanted to be aces. Now, to be an ace, it meant you had shot down at least 3 enemy planes. And so what would happen is fighter planes would be tasked with flying protection missions for bombers. They would be escorts for bombers going into enemy territory. And their job was to fight off any attackers so that the bombs could safely deliver their payload. But what would happen is a fighter would see an enemy come along and the escort would take off after him because they wanted to shoot down at least 3 of them. And the bomber would be left alone. Guys, where are you? And that bomber might not make it home because their escort had abandoned them, and bombers fly a lot slower and don't have the same armament as fighter planes. So Davis realized this, and he also realized that they were going to be, as African Americans and pilots of color, and I say pilots of color because some of them were not African American, some of them were Caribbean, some of them were Black Latino. And he said to them, we are not chasing glory. We are here to protect these bombers. And so this rumor developed that the Tuskegee Airmen had never lost a bomber on a mission. And that was not true, but they always stuck with their planes. They always stuck with their planes. They had an excellent record. And that is why they became known by the bomber crews as the Red Tail Angels, because if you saw an escort with red tail, a red painted tail, then you knew that they were going to stick with you all the way. So there's this concept in the African American community in World War II called double victory. We were living in a segregated society in the United States, and African Americans thought that if they could prove themselves and their worth in World War II, that they would win a double victory. They would win equality in the United States, and they would have helped win the war. But that was not to be, in part because a lot of white America did not know about the Tuskegee Airmen. This is a slide for Wings for This Man. It was a fundraising propaganda movie actually narrated by our President Ronald Reagan. And because he was an actor, if you guys remember that. But it was only shown in African-American communities. And war bond posters featuring African-American pilots were only shown in African-American communities. And so when the pilots came back after the war, after having successfully bombed the Daimler Chrysler tank factory in Germany and having really helped make a difference in the war, they got off the ship and there were signs up that said, whites this way, coloreds that way. And they realized that they'd come home to a country that still had not acknowledged them. And what's remarkable to me is this is the cycle of history. This is what happened in World War I. It was happening again in World War II. But there are some amazing people who've worked to make sure that the heritage of the Tuskegee Airmen stays alive. So I was fortunate enough to, after the book came out, to go to a Tuskegee Airmen Incorporated convention in Las Vegas. And so these 3 ladies here are the daughters of one of the first Tuskegee Airmen. His name is Sparky Roberts, and he's in the poster behind us with a big smile on his face. And I also got to meet some amazing people, like this young lady, Callie Gentry, was secretary to Benjamin O. Davis. And she is also a Spitfire to this day. And this is Nancy Lieutenant Colon, who actually just turned 100 on September 29th. And she was a nurse. And I met her and I asked her what it was like to be a Tuskegee Airman, because that's something I also learned, that in order to be called a documented Tuskegee Airman, you had to work in the Tuskegee program, but it didn't mean you had to be a pilot. So all of the support staff are also considered Tuskegee Airmen. There were a lot of women because there were nurses, there were administration assistants, and some of the mechanics were also women on the stateside base. But she said that the pilots were afraid of her because she had the ability to ground them. And I love knowing that there was a woman who held that kind of power during the war. So the Tuskegee Airmen are remembered now and are being honored today in a way that they weren't when they came back from the war. In fact, I remember reading a story of a woman who in the 70s told her college professor that her dad had been a pilot in the war, and she was African American. And her professor told her that's impossible. Black people didn't fly in the war. So as late as 1970, people thought that. And it reminds me of my own professor who had never heard of the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, which is why in this anniversary year, it's important to remember those who came before us and who fought for our freedoms. So here are some of the books that I used in researching the Tuskegee Airmen book. The Freedom Flyers is actually a transcript of oral histories where you can hear a lot of these pilots tell their own stories. And if you want some great photos, I recommend the Tuskegee Airmen Illustrated History to see what life was like for these guys. And I'm going to take a sip of water, and then we'll talk about the Blossom and the Firefly. All right. So I have written World War II stateside with Fly Girl, and I've written World War II in Europe with the Tuskegee Airmen, because when they were finally deployed, they were in North Africa, and then they were stationed in Italy and flew sorties into Germany. So while I was researching that book, I came across a photograph that inspired the Blossom and the Firefly. And I believe this is the photograph. So what you see here are Japanese schoolgirls holding cherry blossoms, and they're waving goodbye to this Japanese fighter plane. Now I saw this photo and I thought, what is going on here? And the article was about a peace museum in a town called Chiran. Chiran is on Kyushu Island, which is the southernmost island in Japan before you hit Okinawa. And Okinawa is where, you know, some of the biggest battles of the Pacific theater occurred. So as it turns out, Kamikaze pilots, a lot of Kamikaze pilots flew out of Chiran. So Kamikaze, as you may know, is a suicide pilot. These were pilots who would fly off and crash their airplanes into enemy ships to try to sink them. And this is it's a sort of a devastating program that started off by accident. Earlier in the war, a pilot might have a damaged plane and realize that they're not going to make it back to base. And so they would decide to try to take out the enemy with their lives, since they were, rather than just throw their lives away. But by 1944, Japan is losing the war and things are getting sort of desperate. And what they have seen is when a kamikaze pilot would attack a plane, it really, really damaged the morale of the Allies. And so they decided to make it an official program in the fall of 1944. Kamikaze is what we call the pilots, and that name comes from a Japanese legend of a divine wind. Kamikaze means divine wind, that the god supposedly sent to blow away invaders in ancient Japan. But the kamikaze were actually called, I'm going to read the name because I know I won't get it right, but it's Tokubetsu Kogeki Tai, which is special attack pilots, and the short for that was Tokkōtai. But the Tokkōtai also had other nicknames, and Firefly is one of them because they lived brief lives. And so in my research, what I found was that by the spring of 1945, these pilots were as young as 17. So they were called Fireflies, they were called boy pilots. They were also called dragonflies because that is a symbol of bravery in Japan. The dragonfly cannot fly backwards. backwards. It can only fly into whatever it must face. Something else that was happening during the war in Japan is school children were mobilized to help the war effort. And in this town in Chiran, the schoolgirls at the junior high, so these girls are 13, 14, and 15 years old, for a time were assigned as maids to the pilots at the airbase. And their job in those few days while the pilots were waiting for their final mission, the girls would serve them their meals, do their laundry, make their beds, and their last job was to line the runway and wave goodbye. And that's what's happening here. When schoolgirls were mobilized, they were formed into units, or tai, that were named after flowers. And so the girls in Chiran were called Tokkōtai. Nadshiko is a sort of delicate looking flower that can grow in hardy circumstances. And Nadshiko is also the word for the Japanese feminine ideal. And so that is where Blossom in my title, Blossom and the Firefly, comes from. And it is the story of a Nadshiko-tai girl named Hana who meets a 17-year-old Tokkōtai pilot. And it is the 8 days that they share together. But I wrote the book because I wanted to understand, how do people, look at this, smiles and puppies, how do people who are human beings decide to throw their lives away, in my opinion, but to give their lives so irrevocably, it's not like there's a chance you'll survive this, to deliberately throw your life away for your country. And so Taro's story in the book, I follow him from infancy, because there's a lot of work that goes into making somebody a patriot. There's a lot of indoctrination that can happen. Stories that were popular fairy tales in Japan when Taro was a child are turned into propaganda as the war comes along, so that you are, there's something deep inside you connected to this idea of sacrifice. So what made me the person to write this book? I thought of this as an act of inquiry and empathy, because we're all humans on either side of a conflict. So I went to Japan, and I went to Chiran, and I visited the Peace Museum, which is built where the base used to be. And what you see here is in these forests, this all used to be part of the base. The airplanes were parked in these, you see this embankment was nicknamed an octopus pot because it was supposed to help protect the planes from bombing. They couldn't always keep them under cover of the trees, which you can see grow quite close together. So these embankments were supposed to help when a bomb would drop, any percussion might be deadened by the soil there. In this photo, you see the back of my guide and translator, Reiko Yomashura. We drove all through the region trying to find locations that take place in the book. And here we are on the search for a replica of the barracks where the pilots would sleep, which were these triangle barracks that were dug into the earth and play an important role in the book. But you can see here that there's a sleeping platform, and each soldier has his own futon, and they would roll it up in the morning and they would sit on that platform, and the girls would come in and serve them their meals there. So a lot of their time on the base was spent waiting in these semi-underground triangular barracks. Outside of the Peace Museum in Chiran, there is a replica of a plane and a statue of Kamikaze pilot. And forgive me because I did not, I don't quite remember. I've been to 2 museums where there were pilots who were either looking south to Okinawa, where their final mission would be, or looking north to Tokyo, where the emperor was. And so here he is, I believe he's looking towards Tokyo. But there's this second statue to the side. And this is called the Mother of the Kamikaze, because these women were not allowed to show sorrow for letting their sons go off to war and certain death. And so the way they're arranged is he's looking towards his duty and she's looking towards her son. And that is at the heart of my story, is this sense of loss. and the loss of the best of a generation in war. Now, you'll see this picture here of Tome Torihama is the smiling woman in the photo. She was known as the Mother of the Kamikaze because she owned the one restaurant in town. This is a replica of that restaurant. The original is no longer standing, but she owned the restaurant in town where the pilots were allowed to go for R&R. It was the one place they could go if they left the base. And she took care of them. She sold her own belongings to be able to feed them their favorite foods before their last missions. And they called her mother for that. They would give her their letters home that weren't censored by the military censors. So she has a collection of letters that are in this, has been turned into a museum. So you can see some of the letters. But she also loved these boys so much that she built an inn for their families to stay. So that the families could come and say goodbye to them. And so you can stay in this inn to this day. And I was fortunate enough to go and do that. It is run by her children and grandchildren now, and great-grandchildren. And I have eaten in this room, which is a room that the pilots themselves ate in. So let's see. One of the things that Tome did was she was motherly to the Japanese soldiers when they were there, and when the war ended and the Americans came in, she also treated them with kindness, and they called her Mama-san. She worked for years to raise money to build a shrine for the souls of the kamikaze pilots that you can visit to this day, because she wanted their souls to rest in peace. So it was invaluable for me to be able to travel to Japan to see these things and to talk to people. I talked to people who had been alive during the war. Most of them were children during the war, but to really get a sense of the place and of what it meant to be there in that time. So here are a bunch of the books that I used for reference. And again, I can give you a bibliography of these if you have any interest, but the things I want to point out are Blossoms in the Wind is a start to finish amazing nonfiction book about the kamikaze pilots, and The Last Zero Fighter is about Navy pilots, because the pilots I wrote about were Army. But these other two books, Leaves from an Autumn of Emergencies and Listen to the Voices from the Sea, are about, are letters and, what's the other word? They are letters and they are diaries, because Japanese school children had to keep diaries during the war, and a lot of Japanese kept diaries throughout the experience. So to be able to learn from their experience, these were invaluable. So that's the journey for these three books. And I'm just going to put this up for a second. This is my website, sherrielsmith.com, and Kate is back, so I'm ending, but maybe I've run over because I don't have a clock in front of me. But sherrielsmith.com is my website, and if you go there, under books, you'll see teaching guides. And if you click on The Blossom and the Firefly, you'll be able to get a biography. And that's my Twitter handle if you want to follow me and my nonsense on Twitter. Or if you want to ask me any questions we don't get to today. So I'm going to stop sharing, and we are back.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Sheree, so much. You did not run over at all. We have all day to talk about these books and these subjects. But we do have a lot of questions coming in. And so a fair amount are actually about being an author and writing. But I want to start off with a content question that came in through the Q&A. And Asher wants to know, so during World War II, why would the Air Force have racial segregation in the first place? Why were units segregated?
Okay, why were units segregated in the first place is a great question. And, you know, it speaks to race relations in this country. I'm going to, hold on just a second. I'm dropping a really messy link for the bibliography into the chat. You know, it's a great question. And, I've been writing about the civil rights movement in this country. And that's the truth of it, is you can trace the Jim Crow Army back to the Jim Crow laws and back to African slavery trade. The slave trade in this country set a tone for the haves and the have-nots and who deserves what. And that carried through. After slavery ended, there was this short period called Reformation, in which it seemed as if we might actually start on even footing and come up with some rules for equality, but that failed. The rules for equality failed, and instead, particularly in the Deep South, Jim Crow laws were enacted. And then, of course, there was still prejudice everywhere because you had a group of people who had been denied privilege and education and good jobs, and now were looked down upon it for that, even though they had been denied it quite violently for hundreds of years. And that carried over into the military. The fear was that there were a lot of Southern people in the military who would not serve with African Americans. And so the excuse was, well, it would cause too many problems to desegregate, so we're gonna have to keep people separate. That was the excuse, because there was also prejudice and racism coming from Northerners as well. So yes, but in 1948, after World War II, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed an act to desegregate the military. So that is part of the legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen, is that they did get the military desegregated, but desegregation on paper and in reality are two different things, and it took much longer for the culture to change.
Awesome, thank you so much. And if you're interested, next week, we are actually doing another webinar with the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, and we explore actually World War II as being one of the catalysts for the modern civil rights movement, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And I'll give more info at the end. But going back to your writing, we have a question coming in from Facebook. Are there any similar themes that are part of all your books?
Oh, yes. Yes, that's a great question. Well, something that I've found is, and I think this is true for every writer, if you read enough of their work, that our stories are kind of like, our characters are like an acting troupe, and they might play different roles in each book, but they might be a different character name and look different in each book, but they, the themes are similar. So I tend to write about identity. I write about family, and about finding your true family. So that recurs throughout all of my fiction, less so in the nonfiction, because obviously I'm constrained by reality, darn reality.
And speaking and keeping with the theme of writing and you, we have another question from Facebook. Do you have any advice? We have some young writers on this Zoom webinar, and so we have one of them asking, do you have any advice for young aspiring writers watching with us today? What would you give them?
I do. The number one thing is to do it. There are a lot of people who say that they're writers, but they just talk about it. Or they say, I've got a book, but it's all up here. Nobody can read your mind. So if you want to be a writer, be a writer. Do it. If you can, do it every day, so you develop a writing practice and you get used to it. I think it's important to rewrite, revise. I think teachers like to hear that. And when I was in school, I hated revision, but the first draft is where you get all your ideas on the page, good, bad, ugly, whatever they are. And then the real work is in refining that. So don't be afraid to revise. Don't share your work with people until you have revised. It's a bit like showing somebody, an image of a sonogram, like an image of an unborn baby, and saying, isn't my kid beautiful? It's like, well, wait till they fully develop and come out into the world, and then I will take a look. So just stick with it. And some people will not support it, but they don't have to. Just believe in it for yourself.
Awesome. And we have another question that just popped up. How do you personally get over writer's block? Sometimes it's hard to put words on paper.
And you're going to hate me because I say there's no such thing as writer's block. All that is you getting in your own way. So when I'm working on something, if I get stuck and I think that I don't know what to do, it usually means that either I'm afraid or I need to do more research. So particularly with the historical fiction, I always do more research and it triggers something. If it is fear because you don't want to write something bad. You know, when I was a kid, and I've been writing since I was like 10, not good, but I've been writing, and I have a collection of blank journals because I was afraid to ruin them with bad ideas. And now I've ruined a lot of journals with bad ideas. So what I would do is journal. So sit down at your computer or at a pad of paper and just start writing. It can be anything. It can be what you ate, what you need to buy for the grocery. You can write about, and this is something I do almost every morning, you can write about what you need to write about. I'm working on a book now, and I'll say I'm supposed to write a scene where this thing happens, but I don't really have any ideas. I suppose if I did, it would go like this. And give yourself permission to write poorly, and that will free you up.
That is great advice. And we did put your website in the chat and on the Facebook links. Is that how, if teachers wanted to get in contact with you, they could go to your website?
Yes, there is a contact page on my website, and you can email me there. Let me know you met me here. And yeah, we can talk.
Awesome. Well, we have one more question, and I'm actually then going to end with a quote from, I don't want to say favorites, but I really, really liked The Blossom and the Firefly. But another question, what is your, and this is probably going to be really hard to answer, what is your favorite story you've uncovered over the years?
My favorite story I've uncovered, so like historical fiction?
It can be anything, really,
anything.
But you know.
Anything. That is a hard one because there's always something. There's always something sort of amazing. Wow. That is this is something that I don't know if it's my favorite, but it comes to mind. I have two stories that come to mind in researching World War II. And one of them was I met a fellow who had served in the war, and he had lied about his age and was 16 when he enlisted. And he, as he put it, he learned to drive a tank before he got his driver's license. And I always like that idea because in a modern society, like that sounds so terrifying to me, like a 16-year-old with a tank, but I liked learning that. And, meeting Bob Friend, Lieutenant Colonel Friend, was a really moving experience for me. And unfortunately, Bob passed away last year, and at his funeral, which was amazing, it was at an air museum in Palm Springs, where they actually have a flyable replica of his P-51 Mustang. And there was this big ceremony, and one of the stories they told was that Bob, when he was, he's an old guy now, right? He was an older man, and he had an appointment somewhere that he had to go to, and his daughter was going to take him in the morning, but he wanted to get there early. And so she gets this phone call at like 6 in the morning, and it's the police. And she's like, what's happening? And they're like, you need to come here. Your father is here. He was not allowed to drive anymore, but he didn't want to be late for his appointment. So he got up at 4 in the morning and drove to wherever he was supposed to go. And so she gets there, and the police are like, we're not going to do anything to him. Like, this guy is an American hero. And so she gets him in the car, and he's all angry about it. And the police said, as they were leaving, the policeman tapped him on the window, and he rolled down the window, and he said, I just want to thank you for your service. And Bob said, well, I'd like to thank you for your service, but I can't. Rolled his window back up. So I think for me, it's meeting the people. It's meeting the people that are a part of it that is a treasure.
I agree. I think my favorite part of studying World War II is the people and learning the individual stories. 16 million men and women in America served from all different backgrounds and colors, and they each have their own individual story. And it's so important to recognize, well, as many of them as we can. And here at the museum, we actually have, it doesn't fly, it's hanging from the ceiling, but a restored P-51 Mustang that is painted in the likeness of actually Dr. Roscoe Brown Jr.'s plane. So if you come to our museum and you come to the Boeing building, you'll see that plane. But I want to, and then I'll turn it over to you for the last words, with a part of the author's note that really stuck out to me. from the book, The Blossom and the Firefly, those of you who have the book and are following along. On my research trip to Chiron, did I say that right? Please correct me if I said it wrong.
Good enough, yeah.
Okay.
No, I'm saying it wrong too. I took Japanese, but it's a challenge for me.
I was joined by several school kids on class trips. It was both sad and heartening to see them comprehend the human cost of the Pacific War. The scene was later repeated that week on a visit to the Peace Memorial Museum in Hiroshima. My guide, who we saw the back of her, I think, in some of the pictures, expressed surprise at seeing so many school groups present. When I said it seemed to be rather obvious of a destination, she replied, "They used to just go to Disneyland. Times are changing. May we change with them and for the better." And so I want to thank you for joining us today for this very important program. It is being recorded for those of you who are watching it. It'll be on YouTube later today. But Sheree, I'm going to give the final words to you. And again, thank you so much for joining us today for this very important webinar.
Thank you, Kate. For those of you who haven't had a chance to visit the National World War II Museum, it is phenomenal. And I hope that when you're able to travel safely, that you get there, because it made a real impression on me. The last thing I guess I would want to say is, we live in difficult times right now, and dangerous times, and unprecedented in a lot of ways, but also precedented, right? We've been in massive pandemic before, we've been in political turmoil before, and we've come through it because we hold to this ideal of what our country can be. And I hope that each of you carry the goodness of that forward, and that we can find a way to come together and live in peace. I dedicated The Blossom and the Firefly to peace, and I wrote that before I could imagine where we would be today. But it's truer than ever. And I just hope each of you stay safe and healthy and take care of each other, because that's how we move forward.
Thank you so much. And again, please join us next week at the same time for our webinar with the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. Everyone have a great rest of your day.